Dare to Oppose Part 6. Parallel World, Book 4. Written and narrated by Christine Kersey. Chapter 69. Billy. Saturday morning arrived before I knew it, and as I packed my few belongings into a suitcase that Morgan's parents had let me borrow, I wondered how this day would go. "Looks like you're ready," Morgan said as she came into the living room. I smiled at her. "I'm packed, but I'm nowhere near ready." "What are you worried about, Billy? Your parents want you there." Hearing her say that boosted my mood, but that wasn't what concerned me. "I'm nervous about meeting their friends and family," I said. I frowned as I imagined them coming at me with accusing fingers. "You know they're not going to believe my story." "Maybe not at first, but the important thing is that your parents believe you." She moved to stand right in front of me. "And I believe you. I was there too." She laughed. "I was the one who started this whole thing." Smirking, I stroked her cheek. "Just remember that when they start hurling nasty comments at me." "Oh, I will. I'll be right there beside you." "I'm glad you're coming with me," I said. Then I kissed her. Her arms folded around my neck as mine went around her waist. I didn't know what I would do without Morgan. She meant everything to me. The doorbell rang, which sent my heart thundering in my chest. I stepped back from Morgan. "They're here!" She took one of my hands in hers. "It's okay. This is a good day." Her words and her presence calmed me. I nodded, then walked to the door and pulled it open. My mother stepped toward me and pulled me into an embrace, and as I let her envelop me, I looked over her shoulder to see my father standing there wearing a smile. "Good morning," he said when our eyes met. My mother released me, but kept an arm around my waist. "Good morning," I said. Then I turned to Morgan. "This is my good friend Morgan. I hope you don't mind, but I asked her to come with me today." "Nice to meet you finally," my father said. "Hello, Morgan," my mother said. "We're happy to have you come along," he said. Then his smile grew. "I actually have some questions for you." "Okay," Morgan said, but I could tell she was a little wary about what those questions would be. Morgan's family came into the living room to tell me goodbye. We told Amy, Zach, and Brandon that I was going to move in with a new family, but we didn't tell them anything about this world's Billy Foster. That seemed like more than they needed to know. "Billy's a great kid," Morgan's dad said to my father, surprising me. "We already know that," my father said, surprising me even more. "I'll come visit a lot, I'm sure," I said, wanting to shorten the goodbyes. "I'll have some new card tricks to show you the next time you come over," Zach said. "That's great." I hugged everyone goodbye, then Morgan and I left with my parents. "We'll give you some time to get settled," my mother said from the front seat. "Then later this afternoon we'll have a few people over for a barbecue. It will just be family though, grandparents, aunts, and uncles." "Okay." My family had never been close, so we'd rarely spent time with our extended family. At the thought of having so many people suddenly in my life, I began to feel overwhelmed. Morgan must have sensed my discomfort because she slid her hand into mine. I immediately felt calmer. When we got to my new home, Morgan and I followed my parents inside and down a hall to a bedroom. "This will be your room," my mother said. I wondered if it was Billy's room, and though I feared that asking would make my parents sad, I had to know. "Was this Billy's room?" "No," my father said, then pointed to a closed door across the hall. "That's his room." He smiled sadly. "We haven't been able to bring ourselves to go through his things just yet." I nodded, and we all stood there. "Well," my father said, "I'll let you get settled." "Okay." I watched them leave, then Morgan plopped down on the bed while I began unpacking the suitcase. "This is a nice room." She leaned back on her elbows. Besides the bed, there was a dresser and a desk. Nothing fancy, but I hoped this room would finally be home. The room at Tasco's house had been temporary, and the couch at Morgan's house had definitely been temporary. Would this place be different? "Yeah," I said with a smile. "It'll do." Over lunch, my father dove right in with questions for Morgan. That's one thing I'd noticed about him. He liked to get right to the point. My dad had sort of been that way too, although when this world's father was that way, it didn't bother me. whereas my dad in my world had always come off sounding brusque. "I'm very interested to hear about your experience in the parallel world Billy's been telling us about," he said as he picked up his sandwich. Morgan glanced at me, then looked at him. "It's awful there. As soon as I'd realized what had happened, coming back here was all I could think about." I tried to imagine how Morgan must have felt. Out of place, scared, uncertain how things worked. Kind of how I'd felt when I'd first come here. The only difference was she'd had to learn through her own mistakes, whereas I had her to help me. I reached for her hand under the table and intertwined my fingers with hers as I listened to her tell my father her story. When she was done, both of my parents were clearly amazed by what she'd experienced. "Thank goodness you were able to make it back," my mother said. "That place sounds like a nightmare." Morgan smiled at me, then turned to my parents. "If it wasn't for Billy, I never would have made it back." They looked at me, and I could see the pride in their faces. Morgan told a compelling story, and they obviously believed her. It helped that what she said completely matched up with what I told them, but I was grateful that they didn't seem to have any doubts. As the time for the barbecue drew near, my stomach began to churn, and I wished I could hide in my new room. Morgan sat beside me on the couch as my mother worked in the kitchen. "Are you sure you don't need any help?" Morgan asked. "Oh no," my mom said. "I just have a couple of things to do. Everyone's supposed to bring something, so it's all under control. You both relax." She smiled at me. "I'm sure you must be a little nervous." She bit her lip. "To tell you the truth, I'm nervous too." Knowing I wasn't the only one made me feel a little better, and it kind of felt like I was on a team with my parents, the three of us, and Morgan, standing united as I met these people. The feeling of having other people on my side was amazing, especially when the people were my own parents. The doorbell rang, and my heart raced as all good feelings fled. Chapter 70. Billy. "Hello, Nicole," my mother said after she opened the door. "Hi, Jason. Please come in." My attention was riveted to the front door, and when a couple walked in, I could immediately see that this woman was my mother's sister. Her eyes went directly to me, and she audibly gasped, then she stared at my mother. "Come meet Billy," my mother said calmly, as if introducing her dead son's clone from a parallel world was an everyday occurrence. She took her sister's arm and propelled her toward me. Thankfully, my father came down the hall and into the living room at that moment. I needed all the reinforcements I could get. "Billy," my mother said, "this is your Aunt Nicole." I stood and held out my hand. "Nice to meet you." Nicole just gasped again, then stared at me with narrowed eyes. I guess she was trying to see if I was wearing one of those real-looking masks that they wore in the Mission Impossible movies. She must have decided I was real enough, because she took my hand in a limp grasp, then quickly let go. "This is just amazing," she breathed. "I can't believe this." "How are you, son?" her husband Jason said. I shook his hand, which was a much firmer grip. "I'm good." "Sit down," my father suggested. Earlier, we'd brought chairs from the kitchen into the living room to supplement the seating area. I pictured all the chairs filled with people who were gasping and staring at me, and I held back a wild laugh. I couldn't blame them for being dumbfounded at seeing me, but I hoped most of them would be better at hiding it than Nicole had been. "This is my friend Morgan," I said, beginning to feel desperate to get the attention off of me. "Hello," Morgan said with a smile. "Are you from—" Nicole glanced at her husband before looking back at Morgan. "That is, where do you know Bill—" She seemed to choke on my name. "How do you two know each other?" Starting to feel sorry for this woman, I held back a smile. Obviously, she was trying her best to be accepting, but was having a hard time knowing what to say. Morgan's smile was friendly, but I knew her well enough to know that she was about to say something that probably wouldn't help the situation. "I met him at the Fat Center where we were both locked up," she stated matter-of-factly. The what?" Nicole asked as she looked at her sister, clearly confused. Maybe she thought FAT was short for a mental institution, and this just confirmed her belief that I was making the whole thing up. "It's the place where the government sends you if you weigh too much, or if you don't follow their controlling rules," Morgan clarified, but when Nicole still seemed confused, she added, "That's how it is in the world Billy comes from." "Oh," Nicole said, like that explained everything. "If it's so bad," Jason asked, "why did you go there?" "It wasn't on purpose," Morgan said. "Why don't we wait until everyone gets here?" my father said. "Then they'll only have to explain once." "Good idea," my mother said with a smile. The 6 of us chatted about non-parallel world-related things, and soon the rest of the guests arrived. My father's brother and his wife, my mother's parents, and my father's dad. I was glad they limited the guest list. Having 7 people sit in judgment at once was more than enough. My parents introduced everyone to Morgan and me, and I settled in for the questions and comments that were sure to come. Not surprisingly, the first one came from my father's dad, Grandpa Foster. "You're a little young to be a con man," he said. "Dad?" my father said in a warning tone, and I felt my heart drop. Already I was being accused of lying. Grandpa Foster glanced at my father, then focused back on me. "You seem to have completely fooled my son and his wife." He narrowed his eyes at my father. "But he always was on the foolish side." If my grandfather in my world was anything like this man, it was no wonder I'd never met him. My dad had never spoken of him, and now I understood why. "Dad," my father said again, "you promised you would give him a chance." "You need the judgment of someone who's not clouded by emotion," Grandpa Foster said to my father. "That's why I'm here." His eyes shifted to me. "Prove to me that you are who you say you are." Everyone was silent, waiting to see where this would lead, but Morgan obviously didn't want to see me treated like this. "He doesn't have to prove anything to you, sir," she said, "or to anyone. You can choose to believe him or not, but your belief doesn't change the truth of what he says." Everyone stared at her, evidently not used to witnessing someone stand up to Grandpa Foster. "If you reject my friend, he'll go on without you, but it will be your loss, not his." She gently squeezed my hand, which was already clasped with hers. All Billy has ever wanted was a family of his own. His family, the one in his world, was despicable in what they did to him. We had high hopes that his family in this world would be different. She smiled at my parents before looking back at Grandpa Foster. So far, his parents have proven that they are very different from what he'd come to expect. I only hope that all of his family in this world are as good and loving as they are. Grandpa Foster sneered at Morgan. "You're even better at this than he is." I wanted to yell at him for talking to Morgan like that, but I also wanted to show respect for my grandfather. I'd never been faced with a choice like that before, and I didn't know what to do. Then I realized what I needed to do. "I'm sorry you feel that way," I said. All eyes swiveled to me. My face reddened at the unwanted attention. "Maybe if you gave me a chance to tell you my story, you would feel differently." "I doubt it," Grandpa Foster muttered loudly enough for all to hear. "Go on then," he said directly to me. "Let me hear for myself this tale you spun for my bleeding heart son." I nodded. "Okay." I paused. "In my world, the government decides how you live your life, what you eat, how often you exercise, how much you weigh. And if you don't follow their rules, they take you away from your family and lock you up in a prison-like place where you're abused." I studied the faces of everyone in the room. They were riveted by my words. Even Grandpa Foster was listening intently. I told them about my life in my world and what my parents had done. When I got to the part where I met Morgan, she took over, telling how she ran away from home and found herself in another world, right up to the part where our lives converged. Then together, we told how we escaped Camp Willowmoss and everything that happened after that, right up until we made it back to Morgan's world. "This world has problems of its own," I said, "but I like it much better than the one I came from. When Morgan told me she was from a parallel world, I thought she was crazy, so I know how you feel. In fact, I never would have believed her if I hadn't followed her through that tunnel and come out in your world and seen the truth for myself." Wondering if our story had any impact, I frowned. "I don't blame you if you don't believe us, but it is the truth." Everyone was quiet as they digested what we'd said. Then my father's brother Ken spoke up. "I understand why Dad is having trouble believing you." He laughed. "To tell you the truth, I had my doubts, but after hearing your story, and for heaven's sake, you look just like our Billy, it's kind of hard to deny what you're saying." "Are you saying you believe their crazy story too, son?" Grandpa Foster asked as he glanced at his watch. "I'm saying my doubts have lessened." "Thank you, Ken," my father said. Ken smiled at his brother. "Why don't you and your friend go out front for a while?" Grandpa Foster said to me. "Give us a chance to discuss this among ourselves." I was more than happy to have a break from being stared at and judged. Good idea. I practically leapt from the couch. Then I pulled Morgan to her feet and we grabbed our coats. Then we walked out the front door. Chapter 71. Billy. "I wouldn't mind overhearing that conversation right now," I said to Morgan after we shut the front door. She laughed. "It would be interesting, that's for sure." A chilly breeze swept over us and I zipped up my jacket. "Let's take a walk. It will warm us up." Morgan took my hand and we walked down the driveway, then turned right and headed down the sidewalk. "Your grandfather is kind of grumpy, isn't he?" I laughed. "I'm not claiming him as my family just yet." "Unfortunately, you can't really pick and choose who's in your family." "I know. I was just kidding." When we reached the end of the street, we kept walking. It felt good to get away from all the controversy that my origins had caused, and when we circled the block and began heading back toward my new home, for a moment I was tempted to walk past my street and not go back. "We don't have to go back just yet," Morgan said, evidently sensing my reticence. "Then let's go a little farther." In reality, I had no intention of not going back, but I wanted to delay it a little longer. Besides, I doubted they were done arguing over the veracity of my story, not with the obvious disbelief Grandpa Foster had. We walked for another 30 minutes before we finally turned back, but once we were half a block from home, I noticed some commotion and several vehicles at my house. "What's going on?" "I don't know. I hope the old man didn't have a heart attack or something." "I don't see an ambulance." I squinted at the vehicles and the people, trying to identify who they were. "Are those news vans?" Morgan asked at the same time that I recognized the logo for a major news channel. "Yeah, I think so." I stopped walking as a sick feeling began growing in my gut. The urge to escape nearly overwhelmed me, but deep inside I knew this was something I had to face. If not today, then sometime soon. Suddenly exhausted, I just wanted to get it over and done with. "Why are they here?" Morgan asked as she looked at me. Then her eyes widened as the truth of the situation obviously came to mind. "Someone must have told them about you." I heard Grandpa Foster's skepticism in my head, and then I remembered him looking at his watch before suggesting that Morgan and I go outside for a while. It had to be his doing. "I'll give you one guess who's behind it," I said. She stared at me, clearly unbelieving a family member could do something like that. "Morgan, he thinks I'm a liar and probably a thief. What better way to expose me for what I am than to shine the spotlight of the media on me?" She squeezed my hand. "It's not just you. It's both of us, together." Knowing she was in this with me lifted some of the burden from my shoulders, but it didn't change anything else about our situation. "Thanks." "What do you want to do? Do you want to catch a bus to my house?" I smiled and shook my head. "No, I want to show them that even with the bright light of the news burning in my face, my story will never change." "Okay." "What about you? You're not the one who's from another world, Morgan. You don't have to say anything." She hesitated, and I knew she wasn't eager to tell her story to the world. "I don't know. I mean, it's one thing to tell a handful of people about what happened, but to tell people on TV?" Worry clouded her eyes. "Maybe you shouldn't do it either." "I have to. I look just like a dead kid, and the dead kid's parents are taking me in. I have to explain that." Even though it was obvious to me what I had to do, that didn't mean Morgan had to have her world turned upside down. Just having her here was all I needed. I decided to make it easy for her. "I don't want you to say anything about your part in this, okay? You just stand off to the side and listen." The worry in her eyes softened. "Are you sure? You don't want me to say anything at all?" I stroked her cheek and smiled. "I'm sure." The tension she'd been holding in her shoulder seeped away, and she smiled. "Okay, but I'll be right there if you change your mind." "I know." But I had no intention of asking her to speak. I kissed her, then took her hand again and walked toward the small crowd that had gathered on my parents' lawn. Chapter 72. Morgan. I admired Billy's courage and his attitude of sacrifice, because that's what it was. He was willing to sacrifice for me so that I wouldn't have to become an object of ridicule as he surely would. I felt like a coward for agreeing to his demand that I not speak, but I'd had more than my share of time on television, and I didn't want to be the center of attention ever again, especially if it had anything to do with parallel worlds or government control or leading a cause. I just wanted to live my life and be left alone. Was that too much for a 16-year-old girl to ask? I didn't think so. "There he is now," Grandpa Foster said, confirming Billy's suspicion that he was behind the circus on his parents' lawn. "The con man of the century." "You're right," I heard someone say. "He looks just like your grandson. It's eerie." "You say your name is Billy Foster," a reporter called out as we approached. "How is that possible? Who are you really? Where are you from?" Billy released my hand, and I stopped where I was and watched as he walked toward the reporter. "My name is Billy Foster." A camera pointed at him as he strode toward the crowd, but he ignored it and focused on the reporter. "Billy," his father said, "you don't have to talk to them. Come inside." He shook his head. "It's okay. I have nothing to hide. I haven't done anything wrong." His parents walked over to Billy and stood on either side of him, then put their arms around him. "Our son," his father said, "is a good person. His story is unusual, but we support him 100%. Euphoria glowed on Billy's face, and I smiled because I knew he'd found the family he'd always craved. "What is his story?" another reporter asked. His father looked at him. "It's up to you, Billy. You can tell them your story or not." "I'll tell you," he said. Then he waited while the handful of reporters gathered around him with their cameras and their microphones. "Most of you won't believe me, but that's okay. It won't change the truth of it." He paused. "Some people believe in parallel worlds and some don't, but I'm proof that they exist." He told them the same story he told his aunts, uncles, and grandparents earlier, leaving me out of the story completely. It felt incomplete without my part in it. I think the reporters sensed that too, because when he finished, the reporters began shouting questions that my story would have neatly filled in. "How did you know about our world?" "How did you know how to get here?" "How did you know what to do once you arrived in our world?" "What made you think our world was any different from yours? Why did you come here?" All of the questions assumed that his story was true, and I wondered if they actually believed him, or if they were just trying to trip him up. When Billy had shared his story, he told the truth, so the questions they battered him with seemed to stump him. I could tell he felt uncomfortable, and I worried how he would come off if he looked like he was going to make something up just to answer their questions. I should speak up, I thought. I have to speak up. But when I took a few tentative steps in Billy's direction, he saw me and subtly shook his head. I stopped, undecided about what to do. "Billy, why are you pretending to be from another world?" one reporter shouted. "What's in it for you?" "Is this a joke?" another one asked as the tide seemed to turn away from believing him. "Prove what you're saying. Take us to your world. Then we'll believe you." Even from where I stood, I could see panic growing in Billy's eyes. I was the only one who could possibly help him. Even if I failed miserably in convincing anyone of the truth, I still had to try. I had to stand up for Billy and what I knew was true. "He's telling the truth," I shouted, making my voice heard above the clamor. Everyone turned to me and I froze, suddenly regretting speaking up. "Who are you?" one of the reporters asked. I'm Morgan Campbell." I cleared my throat. "I'm the one who told Billy about our world, and I'm the one who showed him how to get here." As one, the reporters moved to me. My eyes went to Billy's face, and I saw him smile, and I knew it was okay that I was speaking up. I smiled back, understanding that he'd only been trying to protect me, as he'd always done, but I had to do what I knew was right, regardless of the consequences. "You look familiar," one of the reporters said. "Where might I know you from?" I could think of 3 places: the PSA, the video students had taken of me arguing with Holly, and the new We Can Choose spot. Not wanting to mention any of them, I shrugged. "It'll come to me," she said with a grin. "How did you meet Billy?" another reporter asked. "How did you tell him about our world?" "I found his world completely by accident," I began, then launched into my story, ending with the night Billy showed up at my house. Like Billy, I didn't name names, as I didn't want to hurt anyone in this world with the actions of their other world selves. Also like Billy, I never mentioned the hut or the tunnel. Only bad things would come if anyone knew the way we'd crossed from one world to another. When I finished talking, the reporters were quiet as they processed my story, then they all began shouting questions at once. "How did you know you'd be able to get back to our world? How did you cross from one world to another? What was it like to be tortured? Tell me more about the fat centers you stayed in." Then a reporter asked a question that caught my attention. "Do you think our world is in danger of becoming like Billy's?" I zeroed in on the man who asked it. "Yes, I do think our world could become like Billy's. Are you aware that the schools are requiring students to be weighed once a month, and that the government has passed new rules regarding what foods can be sold at school?" "That's where I've seen you," the reporter who recognized me earlier shouted, drawing my attention to her. "You were in a video where you argued with a woman from the HLO who was speaking at your school, right?" So that was the one she saw. Better than mentioning the PSA. "Yes, that was me." "Are you staging this just to get your point across?" she asked. Is that what they thought? That was absurd. I pointed to Billy. How could I stage having him look identical to the Billy Foster who died? I'm just a high school student. At the look of skepticism on their faces, I continued. I only spoke up at the assembly because of what I'd been through in Billy's world. The idea of that happening here terrifies me. I can't stand by and quietly watch it happen. I had to say something. Billy smiled as he listened to me, and a moment later he walked over to me and took my hand in his. "Morgan and I haven't sought the limelight. We didn't call you here. We didn't even know you were coming." He looked at Grandpa Foster, who frowned before looking away. "Morgan and I would prefer to live in complete anonymity. We just want to live our lives in peace." "But if what you're saying is true," the woman began, then she smiled, "and I'm not saying I believe you completely, then you need to tell the world what you know." "We've told you," I said. "Now it's up to the world to decide if they want to let our world become like Billy's." I sighed, frustrated that they were concerned about the wrong thing. "Even if you don't believe us, you need to focus on the direction our country is going. Do you want the government to have so much control over your bodies? I know I don't. If you agree," I said as I looked into the camera, "then do something about it. Tell your representatives in Congress to change things. Let your opinions be known. Don't be sheep and just go along with whatever your leaders decide. Have a say in it." "That's all," Billy's father said as he stepped in front of us. "We're done here." Chapter 73. Billy. My eyes went to my father, who stood like a barrier between Morgan and me and the news people. Then I looked at the reporters. They stared at him, then when they saw that he meant what he said, they slowly began packing their things. He turned to Morgan and me. "Let's go inside." I nodded, and we followed him toward the front door. As we approached Grandpa Foster, he wouldn't meet my eyes, and I wondered what my father would say to him. Everyone trooped inside, including Grandpa Foster, and my mother shut and locked the front door. "I can't believe you did that," my father said to Grandpa Foster, fury clear on his face. "How dare you? What were you trying to prove?" Grandpa Foster's lower jaw stuck out in defiance as he glanced at me before meeting his son's eyes. "I was trying to prove that he's a charlatan." He pointed at me as he spoke. "You overstepped your bounds," my father said. Becky and I have made a decision. We would like you to support us, but if you don't, that doesn't change our decision. Billy's moved in with us, and that's where he'll stay, come hell or high water." My father's conviction filled me with an overwhelming feeling of gratitude. I'd never had someone stand by me in such difficult circumstances, besides Morgan, but the man who called himself my father was taking my side over that of his own father. That alone convinced me that he meant what he said. A feeling of security like I'd never known swept over me and settled in my heart. "Thank you," I murmured, my voice thick with unshed tears. My mother came up beside me and slipped one of her arms around my waist, and I put my arm across her shoulders. "I can see I'm not welcome here," Grandpa Foster said. My father stared at Grandpa Foster for a moment. "Dad, you know you're always welcome, but I won't have you treating Billy that way. I just won't." Grandpa Foster stared at my father, nodded once, then he turned and walked out the front door. When the door clicked shut, everyone looked at each other, at a loss for what to do next. A moment later, Becky's sister Nicole broke the silence. "What do you think will happen when your story makes the news?" She looked right at me, but I didn't have an answer for her. I didn't want to think about what would happen next. "Whatever happens," my father said, "won't change what we've decided. I want to make it clear that Billy is part of our family now. Nothing will change that. Have I made that clear?" Everyone agreed that they understood, and my feeling of security locked down that much tighter. "When do you think they'll show your story on the news?" my mother asked. "Only one way to find out," my father said. Then he turned on the TV. The local channels weren't showing any news broadcasts, but the national channels were. We watched for a while, then finally saw what we'd been waiting for. "There it is," my mother said, her voice filled with a mix of excitement and apprehension. A pair of teenagers who say that not only do parallel worlds exist, but the young man claims to be from one, and the young woman claims to have visited it. The tone of the reporter's voice showed how unbelievable he found our story. Let's listen to what they had to say. The news program played a snippet of us speaking, highlighting the parts about the fat centers. "You can view the entire news conference on our website." Then he went on to another story. "I wonder how many people will watch the whole thing," Morgan said. "I don't know," I said. "I'm more interested to know how many will believe us." "And how many will recognize a similarity between your world and where ours is headed," she murmured. "Well," Nicole said, "I think it's amazing." She smiled at both Morgan and me. "The two of you have seen and experienced things that no one else has. I think you'll find that there are many people who will want to know more." She paused. "I wonder how I would react if I lived in your world, Billy. Would I follow the rules, or would I try to change them?" That set off a lively conversation where everyone speculated about what he or she would do if faced with the same issues. Morgan and I didn't participate in the debate. We'd already proven where we stood, but I thoroughly enjoyed being part of a friendly group of people who had now become my family. The more I listened to them, the more I liked them, and as I watched them interact, warmth toward each and every one of them grew within me. Eventually, my parents started the barbecue, but just as we sat down to eat, the doorbell rang. The room went silent and everyone's eyes went to me. "Do you think it's more reporters?" my mother asked in a near whisper, as if the person at the door would overhear her. "Don't worry, Billy," Uncle Jason said. "We won't let them bother you." The rest of the group nodded, some of them saying, "That's right." To have so many people close ranks around me, my heart seemed to grow within my chest, and a feeling of fullness I'd never experienced before nearly overwhelmed me. "Thank you," I murmured as my father walked to the door. All eyes were riveted to the front door as my father pulled it open. Grandpa Foster stood on the porch. "Dad," my father said. "May I come in?" Grandpa Foster asked. My father pulled the door open wider and allowed Grandpa Foster to enter. "Of course." "Thank you." Grandpa Foster walked into the dining room where we were all assembled and ready to eat. "I can see I came just in time." His eyes twinkled, then he turned to me. "I've had a little time to think about what you said, and to tell you the truth, I think I'm starting to believe your convoluted story." A half-smile turned up one side of his mouth as he chuckled. "It's almost too wild to be a lie." His gaze took in both me and Morgan. "And both of you told the same exact story as you told us before the media arrived. Not one variation. I've heard enough false stories in my life to know that the teller usually changes at least one little thing when they retell their lies. And with all the details you had, and with nothing changing—" He paused. "Well, I just might be rethinking my earlier opinion." Surprised but pleased, I didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry that I caused you so much difficulty today, young man." Grandpa Foster pressed his lips together for a moment. "I just want what's best for my family, and I was concerned." "I understand," I said. "If I were you, I'd probably doubt me too." His face smoothed into a smile. "Well, I hope I'll be able to get to know you a little better." Then he laughed. "I have to admit, I already feel like I know you. I guess because you remind me so much of my grandson." I couldn't imagine how it must be for these people to know and love someone and then to basically have a clone of that person show up to replace him. "Thanks." "Dad, please join us," my father said as he gestured to an empty chair. "Don't mind if I do," Grandpa Foster said. During the meal, everyone talked comfortably, and it almost seemed as if they'd forgotten the bizarre way I'd come into their lives. I began to believe that this could actually work out. When it was time for Morgan to go home, my mother offered to drive her. As we pulled up to her house, I felt sad that I wouldn't see her as often as I'd gotten used to seeing her, but my happiness at having a family of my own more than made up for that. "I'll walk you to the door," I offered. "Do you want to come in?" she asked as we climbed the stairs to her porch. I gestured to the car idling in the driveway. "I'd better not." "When will I see you again, Billy?" Her face was downcast. "Let's plan on next Saturday, and we can talk on the phone between now and then." "You'll have to let me know how it is at your new school." I nodded. "I will." Pulling her into my arms, I kissed her, then after I let her go, she smiled and went into her house. Chapter 74. Morgan. Telling Billy goodbye felt so final, but I kept reminding myself that he only lived an hour away. I hadn't mentioned it to him, but I was worried about how the kids at his school would react to him, especially if they saw the news report with us telling our story. Would they ridicule him? Torment him? Hurt him? Fresh worry that bullies at his new school would beat him up raced through me. After all this time, he was finally happy. I hoped and prayed that no one would ruin that for him. "Hi, Morgan," Amy said from her place on the couch where she was immersed in a book. "Hey." I glanced around. "Where's Mom and Dad and the boys?" "They went to some dumb movie that they'd been wanting to see." I sat beside her on the couch. "I have to tell you something." She set her book down and looked at me with curiosity. "What is it?" "Today something happened that you'll hear about, but I want to tell you about it myself first." "Okay." At the earnest look on her face, I flashed back to my time at Camp Willamoss when I'd been in Amy's room and had been about to reveal that I wasn't Hannah Jacobs, but that I was Morgan in disguise. I'd been so worried that she would hate me for being responsible for her being sent to the Fat Center, but she'd been thrilled that it was me and had shown unwavering support. "I haven't told you everything about Billy and where I met him." Her attention was locked on me. "What do you mean?" I glanced at the romance novel she'd been reading. Did she ever read science fiction? Had she even heard of parallel worlds? "Have you ever heard of alternate worlds, Amy? Or parallel worlds?" Her nose crinkled as she thought it over. "I guess so." "Do you think parallel worlds, a world just like ours but different, do you believe they exist?" Uncertainty clouded her features. "I don't know. Why? What does that have to do with anything?" "Well, you remember that night I ran away?" She smiled with confidence, like she was on familiar ground now. "Yeah, of course. That was the night you snuck out to meet Billy." "The truth is, Amy, when I left, I hadn't met Billy yet." Fresh confusion washed over her face. "I don't understand." "I wasn't meeting Billy. I was running away." "You told me you were meeting a boy, Billy." That's because you caught me sneaking out, and I didn't want you to tell Mom. So you lied to me. It wasn't a question. I'm sorry, Amy. I didn't know if I could trust you, but now I know I can. My words seemed to assuage any hurt feelings she may have had. Where did you go? I told her how I'd gone into the forest, but I left the details of the hut vague. I found a tunnel and I followed it to the end. I paused as I drew in a breath, ready to tell her the part that would sound the most unbelievable. When I came out of the tunnel, I came straight to our house. The trouble is, you guys didn't live here. She recoiled. What? That doesn't make sense. I know, but it's true. It took me a little while, but I finally figured out that the tunnel I went through had brought me to a parallel world. She stared at me, but didn't speak. Then her questions came in a torrent. How long were you there? Was I there? What did I look like? What was it like there? How did you get home? I smiled. I think the best way for you to get your questions answered is to watch something online. I held out my hand, which she took, and I pulled her to her feet. We walked over to the computer, and as I pulled up the news website that had the entire news conference on it, I glanced over my shoulder at her. Today, at the new place where Billy will be living, I said, some reporters came over. I found the video and pressed the pause button, then I stood and faced her. We didn't know they would be coming, but Billy decided it was time to tell his story, our story, so we did. I gestured to the screen. Sit down and watch. She did as I told her, then started the video. She watched it intently, occasionally looking at me over her shoulder before turning back to the news conference, and when it was over, she looked at me with astonishment. Do Mom and Dad know about this? I nodded. Billy and I told them when he first got here. I can't believe you didn't tell me, Morgan. I'm sorry. We didn't tell anyone. I mean, even Dad didn't believe it for a long time. I'm not even sure he believes it now. A smile blossomed on her face. Well, I think it's totally cool that Billy has a family now. An answering smile formed on my mouth. I know. I'm so happy for him. Did you really go back to that fat center just to help me? I squatted next to the chair so we were eye to eye. Yes, I love you, Amy. You're my only sister. I couldn't stand knowing that you might be suffering. I laughed, even though it wasn't really you. Tears filled her eyes, and she threw her arms around me. I love you too, Morgan. You really are the best sister. Now that she knew what I'd done for her other-world self, I felt even closer to her, and I hugged her back. A moment later, she pulled away. I understand now why you didn't want to do the PSAs. Yeah, it was hard to say the things Holly wanted me to say. I didn't mention that Holly was the one who had tortured me. That seemed like information that Amy didn't need to know. Are you going to tell the boys what happened to you? I shook my head. They're too young. It wouldn't make sense to them. Yeah, you're right. I haven't told Mom and Dad about the news conference, so when they get home, can you take the boys upstairs while I talk to Mom and Dad? Obviously pleased to be in on my secret, she smiled. Sure. When the rest of the family got home, Amy asked the boys about the movie. When they started telling her about it, she suggested they tell her about it upstairs. What was that all about? Mom asked, as the three of them headed up the stairs. I have to talk to you, I said. Then we sat in the living room. I told them how the day at Billy's parents had gone, and then I told them about the news conference. You didn't, Dad said, less enthusiastic than I thought he would be. We didn't exactly have a choice, Dad. Billy's grandfather arranged for the news people to be there without anyone knowing. We were outside when they came. What were we supposed to do? I paused. Besides, it was Billy's decision. He's the one who looks just like a dead kid. Dad sighed, obviously displeased. Well, Mom said, I think it's good to finally have the truth out there. People will have to make up their own minds, of course, but at least Billy won't have to pretend anymore. That's well and good for Billy, Dad said. But what about Morgan and our family? Now everyone we know, and everyone we don't, will think we have a lunatic for a daughter. Thanks, Dad, I said with a frown. He sighed again, louder this time. You keep bringing these things onto yourself, and I'm getting kind of tired of it. I'm sorry that I went to a parallel world and almost got stuck there, but I didn't mean for that to happen, okay? But it did. Whether or not you believe it, it happened. Another sigh flew from his mouth. I don't want to talk about this anymore. He stood. At least Billy's parents believe him, I muttered. Dad spun in my direction. I love you, Morgan, but that doesn't mean I have to believe every word you utter. Then he turned and strode out of the room and up the stairs. I turned to Mom with sadness. You still believe me, don't you? She motioned for me to sit beside her on the couch, which I did. Then she put her arms around me. Yes, I do. I'm sorry your father doesn't, but there's not much you can do about it. You just need to focus on the truth and standing by what you believe in. Thanks, Mom. That night, Rochelle called me. I saw you on TV. You mean the news conference? Yeah. Then she was silent, like she was waiting for me to explain. So what's the deal, Morgan? Why did you say all of that stuff? Because it's true. Silence. Why didn't you and Billy tell me? Would you have believed us? She hesitated. I don't know. I frowned. That's why, Rochelle. I sighed. Look, I'm sorry we didn't tell you, but there really was no reason to. And now both you and Billy are gone, she said. Billy moved a little farther away, but I'm still here, okay? I just go to a different school. I laughed. I'm going to try to come back to Fox Run next school year. You'd better, she said, and I knew everything between the two of us was all right. Chapter 75. Morgan. I'd been so focused on my family and what they thought and how Billy was doing that I'd failed to consider what would happen to me when I got to school on Monday. Whoa, a girl said loudly to another girl when I walked into the building. There she is. She snickered. Or is that really her? Maybe it's a copy of her, you know, from another world. Her friend laughed, and my face heated with embarrassment. I hurried to my locker, not meeting the stares of the other students, got my books, then went to class. I managed to make it through first period without anyone else making snide comments, but as I left the classroom and walked down the crowded hallway to my second period class, I expected someone to shove me or yell at me or something, but I made it to second period in peace. Hey, Morgan, Hannah called to me when I entered the room. I turned to her, expecting her to point at me and laugh, but instead, she motioned for me to sit in the desk next to hers. Torn between not wanting to be associated with her group and wanting to have at least one person at the school who didn't think I was crazy, I hesitated before walking over to her and sitting beside her. How's it going? She asked with a frown, and I wondered if she'd seen the news conference from Saturday. Great, how about you? Are you sure about that? She asked. Not wanting to lay out all of my problems, I decided to pretend like I didn't have any idea what she was talking about. Of course, Hannah. Why? I heard that some people talked to you on Friday. On Friday, I thought. Then I remembered the FBI agents. How I could have forgotten about them was beyond me until I considered all that had happened since then. Yeah. She leaned toward me. What did you tell them? Nothing. Her brow furrowed like she wasn't sure if she could take me at my word. Nothing? Like you didn't talk at all? Practically. Practically? So you actually did talk? The worry lines on her forehead deepened. I thought you weren't worried about your... My voice dropped to a whisper. Friend. I'm not worried about him, she said with intensity. I'm worried about me. Yeah, I thought. Welcome to my life. Well, don't worry, Hannah. I didn't say anything about you. She breathed out a sigh. Thank you. After a pause, she said, Are you going to talk to them again? Not if I don't have to, I said, and I really, really hoped I wouldn't have to. After a moment, I realized that she hadn't said anything about the news conference. Had she somehow missed the gossip that seemed to be circulating about me? So, Hannah, she looked at me with raised eyebrows. Did you hear about my friend Billy? Who? Well, on Saturday something happened that you might find interesting. Sitting up straight, she stared at me. What is it? When you have a minute, you might want to check out a certain website. Then I gave her the web address. She pulled out her phone and immediately started typing in the web address, but before she could begin watching it, the teacher started class. I'll watch it after class, she whispered. Then she put her phone away. I smiled tightly, worried about what she would say after she found out her new friend was insane. When class finished, I gathered my things and stood to leave. "I'll see you at lunch," she said. "Okay." As much as I worried about being associated with We Can Choose, I hated even more the thought of wandering around the cafeteria like a nomad, with everyone at my school knowing about my crazy claims of visiting a parallel world. So I hoped Hannah would still want to see me at lunch after she watched the video. Lunchtime came around faster than I'd anticipated. Fearful that I would be scorned and ridiculed when I walked in, I hung back, hesitant to go in at all. After several minutes, I decided that I had to face the consequences, good or bad, and I walked in. To my relief, no one paid attention to me as I made my way to Hannah and the other girls. As I got closer, I watched their faces, trying to discover whether they were on Team Morgan is crazy or Team Morgan had a cool experience. Hannah and Katie's backs were to me, so I couldn't get a read on their faces yet, but Sarah and Olivia looked up as I approached, and they smiled, which made me think they wouldn't turn against me, at least not yet. I sat in the empty seat next to Hannah. "Hey," I said. She turned to me with wide eyes, then she stared at me before finally asking, "Is it true, what you said on that video?" I met her eyes, then I looked at the other 3 girls before coming back to Hannah. "Yes," I said with a nod, "it's completely true." She shook her head and laughed. "You know you sound like you're nuts though, right? You and your friend both." "Yes," I said with a tone of impatience. "I know." I was getting tired of people automatically doubting me. She scrunched up her nose. Was I there? That was a question no one but Amy had asked. Wavering between whether or not to tell her that she was the girl I impersonated, I hesitated. Her mouth fell open. "I wasn't I?" "Technically everyone who's here was there." "But you knew me, didn't you?" "No, I never met you." Disappointment crashed over her features. "Oh. But you know how I said I pretended to be someone else when I went back into Camp Willamos?" "Yeah. It was you, Hannah. You were part of the resistance there, and I guess you agreed to let me pretend to be Hannah Jacobs when I went back to help my sister." Doubt replaced the disappointment. "Really, Morgan? Are you just trying to make me feel better?" "I'm serious." "What about me?" Sarah asked. Then Katie and Olivia nodded, like they wanted to know if I'd met them. I shook my head. "No, sorry. I never met any of you or heard of any of you." "That's so cool," Hannah said, almost to herself. Then she grinned. "That must be why I'm so, into the We Can Choose thing. It must totally be in my DNA to be a rebel, right?" Maybe I shouldn't have encouraged her. "I guess." Hannah grabbed my arm. "You have to be our spokesperson again, Morgan. You have to." "I don't know. I mean, I've had my 15 minutes of fame. I think it's someone else's turn." She released me. "But what you've been through put such an exclamation point on what we're trying to do. You're the only one who can do it." I knew what she was trying to say, and it wasn't that I disagreed. It's just that I didn't want to have the FBI or any other authority coming after me. I thought about the hacker and how she told me it wasn't going to happen, but that had been a lie. "What about making decisions without letting me have a say?" I asked. "You want to have a say in decisions," she said. "I totally get that. I want your opinion, especially now that I know what happened to you." That was something at least, although I still wasn't sold on the idea of becoming their spokesperson again. "Your friend Billy should do it too," she said as her face brightened with the genius of her idea. "I mean, he's from there. He could totally tell people where we're headed." I couldn't picture Billy agreeing to this, but I had to let him decide for himself. "I'll ask him," I said, "but don't hold your breath." "Thanks," she said. Chapter 76. Billy. "It will be like pulling off a Band-Aid," I said to my mother, who stood next to the breakfast table with a worried look on her face. "You know, just rip it off all at once." "Billy," she said with a frown, "you don't have to go yet. You can wait. Settle in first. Let people know what to expect." My father had already gone to work, and now my mother and I were debating whether or not I should start at my new school. Even though I'd barely moved in, I didn't see the point in waiting. I was certain most, if not all, of Billy's friends had seen the news conference, so they wouldn't be too shocked to see me in person. I just wanted to get it over with. Whether it happened that day or the next month, it would be awkward for everyone. Smiling to soften my words, I said, Look, I'm the one who will have to deal with it, so it should really be my decision." She sighed, then placed a hand on my shoulder. "You're very brave." The smell of pancakes filled the kitchen, and she went to the griddle to scoop out the next batch. "Does that mean you agree?" I asked, trying to get used to this parent-child give and take. "If that's what you want, then yes, it's fine." "Thanks." 40 minutes later, I stood in the office of my new school while my mother filled out the paperwork. "This is highly unusual," the secretary said as her gaze kept drifting in my direction. I wasn't sure which part was unusual, the clone from another world registering at her school or changing schools mid-year. Somehow I suspected it was the former. When my mother completed the forms, the secretary perked up like she was glad to be back to normal procedures. "You're all set?" She handed me my schedule, which my mother and I had discussed with a counselor earlier. "I can have someone show you around if you'd like." "No, that's okay. I'm sure I can figure it out." I just wanted to go to my class and be as inconspicuous as possible. "All right. Come see me if you need any help." "Thanks." "I'll see you after school, honey," my mother said. I smiled at her, appreciative of her concern. Then I walked out of the office and down the hall to find my class. A couple of minutes later, I stood in front of a closed door that I knew I would have to enter. As confident as I'd been at home that morning, now my decision to start school right away seemed hasty, even ill-advised, and I hesitated. More than anything, I wished Morgan went to this school. Knowing I would have her to sit with at lunch, maybe even have a class with, would make everything so much more bearable. I took a deep breath, released it, then twisted the doorknob and pushed the door open. All eyes zoomed right to me, and I heard gasps and whispered exclamations. "It really does look just like him," one girl clearly stated. "Settle down, class," the teacher said, then turned to me with a tight smile. I wondered if he knew Billy Foster well. "Welcome. You may sit in any of the empty seats." I scanned the room, and when I saw an empty seat in the back, I calmly walked toward it. Every single eye followed me, but I forced myself to ignore the other students as I sat at my desk and pulled out my notebook. I turned my attention to the teacher, who seemed just as fascinated by me as the students did, but after a second, he seemed to gather himself and continue what he'd been saying before I arrived. When class ended, no one spoke to me, though I could hear urgent whispers all around me. I loaded my things into my backpack, then stood and left the room, bracing myself for a repeat in all of my classes. Unfortunately, my assumption that I would cause a stir in every class was correct, but the hardest part of the day was lunch. In my world, I'd always enjoyed lunch, and I liked it even more at Fox Run High, but here, at the school the dead Billy Foster had attended, where everyone had either seen or heard about the news conference, I felt like a spectacle, a circus show freak, and I hated it. My parents had promised to get me my own cell phone, something I'd never owned in my life, but as I sat by myself at a table in the cafeteria, I wished I had one already. Not only to call Morgan, but to have something to do besides stare at the food on my lunch tray, food that I'd lost any desire to eat. Resorting to reading one of my textbooks, or at least pretending to read it, I didn't notice a pair of girls approaching my table. "Is it okay if we sit with you?" one of them asked. I looked up to see two girls standing beside my table. I hoped they were sincere in wanting to sit by me, and not just playing a joke for the entertainment of everyone who was watching, which was the entire school. "Yeah, sure." They set their trays on the table across from me, then sat down. "I'm Megan," the girl who'd asked to join me said, "and this is Amber." "Hey," Amber said, barely glancing at me. "Hi." I smiled at them, wary about why they wanted to talk to me when it was obvious that no one else did. Ignoring her food, Megan stared at me. "Did you know Billy?" I asked, wanting to move past the most likely reason for her unabashed gawking. Her eyes widened at my bold question, but then she said, "Yeah, he was my boyfriend last year." Now I was the one who was surprised. Not only was her composure at seeing an exact replica of her dead ex-boyfriend remarkable, but her courage in talking to me was equally amazing. "Oh," I said, "I didn't know he used to have a girlfriend." I laughed self-consciously. Actually, I don't know anything about him, except that he looked like me and that he liked to work on cars with his dad. "This is so weird," she said. Then she turned to Amber. "Don't you think this is just so weird?" Amber nodded, but her eyes skittered right over me, making me think she was only sitting at my table because Megan had made her. "Yeah," I said, "I do." Megan's focus came back to me. "Sorry, I'm not usually so rude. I heard about you and I had to meet you." "I won't bite," I said. "I promise." Amber looked at me sharply, like she expected me to lunge across the table and drag her back to my world. "I know," Megan said with a soft chuckle. Then her eyes filled with tears. "I just really miss him, and I guess I hope that—" A blush rose on her face and she shook her head. "I don't know what I was hoping for. I think you and that girl, Morgan—" I nodded. "Yeah, she's your girlfriend, right?" "Yeah," I said. Then I smiled as I thought about Morgan. Even though Megan was pretty, no one drew my interest like Morgan did. She was the only girl for me. Megan said. Then she picked up her fork and began eating. After a few minutes, she asked, "Is it okay if we're friends?" "Of course. I don't know anyone here." I laughed. "I can always use friends." She smiled. "Good, I'd like that." "What about you, Amber?" I asked. "Me?" Panic filled her eyes. "Don't be a jerk," Megan whispered loudly to her. Yeah," Amber said. "Sure." No one had ever been coerced into being my friend before, but I smiled at her anyway. Great! Their bravery in speaking to me must have helped everyone else realize that I was harmless, because in my afternoon classes, several people spoke to me. Some even welcomed me to their school. To my surprise, no one said anything derogatory to me or implied I was a fake. My guess was that Billy had been well known and well liked, and since I looked just like him, the other kids must have transferred some of that feeling onto me. There were worse things than to be liked just because you look like someone else. "How was it?" Morgan asked that afternoon. I pressed the phone closer to my ear, picturing her face as I prepared to tell her about the first day at my new school. "Weird," I said. "Very, very weird." Then I described everything I'd experienced. She laughed. "Sounds like it ended better than it started." "Yeah, I guess it did." "Well, I have a question for you." "Shoot." "Hannah wants to know if you'll be part of We Can Choose." I was quiet as I thought it over. Why does she want me to be part of her group all of a sudden? "I showed her the news conference, and she said since you're from that world, you would be able to tell people why we should avoid going down the same path." I thought about Nick and his resistance group, and how working with them had made me feel alive. Even though I had only been part of his group for a few weeks, I'd really liked it. My desire to stay with his group had been one of the reasons it had been a difficult decision for me to follow Morgan. Before joining his group, I'd always preferred to stay in the background, but with his group, I'd finally felt like I was making a difference. I still had no desire to be front and center, but since arriving in this world, I'd been struggling to find my place. Maybe being part of We Can Choose was just what I needed to feel at home here, in this world, a way to discover my purpose for being here. "Tell her I'm interested," I said, "but I want to wait until the whole FBI thing cools down before I officially agree to get involved." "Really? You're interested?" Morgan sounded genuinely surprised, and I wondered if she'd forgotten how passionate I'd been about the work Nick and his group had been doing to change people's minds about the way things were in my world. "Yes," I said. "Really." "Okay." I laughed. "Why do you seem so surprised?" "I guess I just didn't think it would be your thing." "Oh yeah? What do you think my thing is?" "I don't know. Escaping from fat centers, maybe?" I could hear the smile in her voice. "There is that, but don't forget that I worked with Nick's group." Chapter 77. Morgan. How could I have forgotten about Billy's involvement with Nick's resistance group? Had I blocked it out? The way he tried to convince me to stay and be part of their group? "Yeah," I said after a moment. "I guess I did kind of forget about that. Maybe because I wasn't with you when you joined them." He laughed softly. "Yeah, your introduction to our group was probably a little more traumatic than mine." Remembering how I'd woken after being taken down by Mills to see Billy hovering over me, and then seeing Mills leaning against the wall, I vividly recalled the panic I'd felt when I thought Billy was part of Holly's group and that he'd betrayed me. That had been one of the worst moments of my life. Traumatic? I said. Yeah, you could say that. I paused. I'll tell Hannah what you said. The next day, I arrived in second period before Hannah, but when she saw me, she sat beside me with a smile. Did you talk to your friend? Billy? I nodded. Yeah, but he wants to wait until the FBI loses interest before he jumps in. Awesome! She looked thoughtful. You know, if you don't want to be the spokesperson, I can ask him to do it. This was a new twist, and I heard myself saying, no, I decided that when Billy starts, I'll be the spokesperson. When had I made that decision? That's fantastic, she said. Having both of you involved will be, her smile grew, amazing. I was glad she thought so because I was already doubting my impulsiveness. We should all get together soon, she said. When can you guys meet with me? Since Billy lived an hour away, it would take a little extra planning to get together with him. Maybe on Saturday, I said. Great, see you at lunch, Morgan. But that didn't happen. Instead, later that morning, Hannah was called into Hanson's office to talk to the FBI agents who evidently hadn't made much progress in catching her hacker friend. She's still in there, Sarah said at lunch after she told me that Hannah had been taken out of their third period class. We sat at our usual table with Katie and Olivia. Are you sure she's being questioned by the FBI? I asked, wondering how Sarah could know for sure. I saw them, Olivia said. I was walking past the office right when Mr. Hanson and 2 men in suits went with her into his office. It sounded like she was indeed being questioned by the FBI, or at least Hanson. When I'd been questioned, I hadn't been in there nearly as long. I wondered if she was telling them about her hacker friend. I worried for her, but there was nothing I could do. What if she goes to jail? Sarah said in a frantic whisper. We all looked at each other. I don't know, I said. Maybe if she tells them the truth, they'll let her go. I hope so, Olivia said. At the end of lunch, we separated for our classes. I purposely walked past the office to see if I could see anything, but Hanson's door remained closed. As it turned out, I should have been more worried about myself than about Hannah. Morgan, my fifth period teacher said after he read the slip of paper a student had just delivered to him. Then he motioned for me to come forward. I went to the front of the room and took the slip of paper. I was being called to see Hanson. Deep down, I knew this was a bad thing, but I just nodded like it was completely expected. Then I went to my desk and gathered my things. I tossed my backpack over my shoulder and left the room, but paused in the hallway. No one was around. To go to the office, I would need to go right. I looked in that direction. Then I went left, hurrying down the hall toward another hallway that would lead me outside. I had no intention of talking to Hanson and his FBI buddies. I'd already told them everything I was going to, so as far as I was concerned, there was no need for me to talk to them again. As I approached the turn in the hall, I heard voices, deep male voices. The girls' bathroom was to my left, so I darted inside and locked myself in a stall. Leaning against the stall door, I considered my options. 1, I could make my way outside, call Mom, and have her pick me up, and end up getting questioned later. 2, I could run away and hide somewhere, although I had no idea where. 3, I could go to Hanson's office and tell them everything I knew. Or 4, I could stay in the bathroom for the rest of my life. I squeezed my eyes closed. None of the options sounded good, and I had no idea what to do. All I knew is that I didn't want to have to face this alone. I wished with all of my heart that Billy was there with me. Billy, I thought. My eyes opened. I'll take the bus to see Billy. Yes, it was just putting off the inevitable, but right then I was all about procrastinating my date with the FBI. No one had entered the bathroom since I'd arrived, so I left my stall with confidence, then went to the door that led to the hall. Pulling the door open, I peered around it, but all was quiet. I stepped into the hallway and made my way to the corner. Slowing as I reached the end of the hall, I poked my head around the bend and made sure the coast was clear before turning the corner and walking toward the exit. Bright sunlight from the square window in the door flooded the hall, and I went as fast as I could without actually running. Moments later, I shoved through the exit and out into the grassy area by the far end of the school building. The rest of the students were still in class, so I was blissfully alone. Glancing around, I made sure no one was lurking just out of sight. Then I broke into a jog to put as much distance between me and Hansen as possible. As I passed through a neighborhood, a feeling of déjà vu washed over me, and I remembered the panicked dash I'd made after breaking free from Holly. Enforcer Mills hadn't been far behind me, and when he'd pulled me down from the fence I'd been trying to climb, abject terror had gripped me. A shudder pummeled me as I imagined Hansen or one of the FBI agents taking me down, and I picked up my pace. A few minutes later, I reached the main road where a bus would eventually come by, and I sat on an empty bench to wait. Panting, I leaned forward and rested my arms on my knees as I tried to catch my breath. When the bus rumbled to a stop in front of me, I climbed aboard. There were only a few other passengers. I went to a seat in the very back and set my backpack on the seat beside me, then leaned my head against the window. I had to change buses to take the express to Billy's town, but when I arrived at my destination, I climbed off and began walking. I knew he would probably be home from school by the time I reached his house, so that's where I headed. Then I thought about Mom. She would be leaving home soon to pick me up. I dug my phone out of my backpack and called home. "Hello?" Mom said. "It's me," I said, trying to put a carefree tone into my voice. "Morgan? Why are you calling? Is everything okay?" Everything was definitely not okay, but I didn't want to tell her that. Not yet. "Yeah, I was just calling to let you know that I wanted to go visit Billy after school today, so you don't need to pick me up." "Wait, you're telling me or you're asking me?" Uh-oh. "I just really miss him, so I was hoping you would let me go see him today. I can take the bus there, and then I can take it home." "Why didn't you tell me about this before school?" "Because I didn't know the FBI would be after me then," I thought. "I just really started missing him today, Mom, so it was kind of last minute." "Oh, Morgan. Please, Mom, please." She sighed. "All right, but call me when you get there so I know you made it safely." "Okay, I will. Thank you, Mom." "Uh-huh." I tucked my phone in my pocket and picked up the pace. Now that I knew I would be with Billy soon, I had a fresh burst of energy. 20 minutes later, his house came into view, and I remembered the impromptu news conference that had happened only days before. His parents had been so supportive of him, but I wondered what they would think of me dropping by unexpectedly. Chapter 78. Billy. "Are you sure you don't want more milk?" my mother asked as she placed another cookie on the plate next to my textbook. "No, I'm full." As much as I liked the way she was taking care of me, I wasn't used to having someone wait on me. It felt kind of weird. "I can't eat anymore, really." "Okay." She picked up the plate with a cookie on it. "I'll put it away for later." I smiled. "Thanks." Then I turned back to the homework assignment I'd been working on. I'd just completed my second day at my new school, and it had gone better than the day before. More kids had talked to me, and some had even asked about the world I'd come from. I could tell they were genuinely curious and not just making fun of me. I'd answered every question, except the ones asking how I'd crossed into this world, and I could tell by the curiosity in their eyes that they would have more questions. I welcomed it. The more people talked about it, the more they would come to accept it as the truth, which would make my life easier. The sound of the doorbell ringing interrupted my thoughts. "Who could that be?" my mother asked as she walked toward the front door, then opened it. I couldn't see the door from where I sat, but there was no mistaking the voice I heard. "Morgan?" I pushed back from the table and hustled to the door. My mouth stretched into a wide smile. "Billy!" I could see the worry in her eyes, and I wondered what had happened. "Come in," I said as my mother stepped out of the way. The moment her path was clear, Morgan practically threw herself into my arms. "What a nice surprise," my mother said as she closed the door, but her tone said she wasn't sure what to do with a girl who had flung herself into her new son's arms. Morgan took a step back and smiled tentatively at my mother. "I'm sorry I didn't warn you I was coming." "That's okay," my mother said. "Of course you're welcome any time." "Thanks." Morgan turned to me. "I need to talk to you." I wondered what she'd gotten herself into now. It didn't matter. I would always be there for her. "I'll let you two chat," my mother said. Then she headed toward the kitchen. "What's up?" I asked. Morgan took me by the hand and led me to the couch where we sat side by side. "I think I'm in trouble." "What kind of trouble?" "The kind where the FBI wants to talk to me." I leaned back on the couch. "Oh, that's not good." "No." "What happened?" She told me how her friend Hannah had been questioned by Hansen and the FBI, and then how Hansen had demanded to see her. "But instead of going to the office, I ditched and came here." As much as I wanted to help her, I had no idea what to do. "Do you think it's about the hack?" She nodded. "I don't know what else it could be." "Maybe it's nothing. Maybe they just need to clarify what you told them before." She bit her lip as she considered my words. "I'm scared, Billy. What if I have to go to jail? I can't go to jail." Her voice rose as panic began to overtake her. "It will be worse than Camp Willamos. I just know it." I wanted to tell her to calm down, but I knew that wouldn't help, so instead I pulled her against me. "I'm right here, Morgan. I won't let anything happen to you." She pulled away. "How can you say that? You can't do anything for me. Hansen hates me. He always has. He'll be thrilled if the FBI arrests me." Helplessness swirled around me. She was right. There was nothing I could do, but I didn't let that stop me from trying to comfort her. I placed my hands on the sides of her face and made her focus on me. "Have you done anything that would justify you going to jail?" "I don't know. I don't think so." "What do you mean you don't know?" "I mean, I knew Hannah's friend was going to hack into the HLO's database and erase their data, and I didn't tell anyone. But I don't know if that's enough to send me to jail." I didn't know either. "What should I do?" she asked plaintively. I moved my hands from her face and took her hands in mine. "I don't know." In silence, we sat side by side, the only sound the ticking of an old clock hanging on the wall. Morgan's cell phone rang, startling us both. She picked it up and looked at the screen. "It's my mom." Chapter 79. Morgan. "Hello?" I said. I talked to Mom less than an hour earlier, so I feared the reason she was calling. "I was checking your grades online," she began, "when I noticed that you missed your last class today." She paused. "Did you cut class so that you could go see Billy?" "Is that all?" I wanted to say. I thought the FBI had come to my house to question me and found me gone. "I'm really sorry, Mom." She sighed. "You're really pushing me, Morgan. Really pushing me." "It was stupid of me. I'll come home." "Yes and yes." That was harsh, I thought. "Okay, it will take me a couple of hours, though." "And not a minute longer." Her impatience showed in her tone. We hung up and I turned to Billy. "I have to go." "I gathered." He smiled. "Do you want me to ask my mother to drive you?" I wasn't in any hurry to get home and face the consequences of leaving school without permission, or of anything else that could possibly happen to me, so I said, "No, that's okay." "I'd go with you, but it's a little far." "You could walk me to the bus stop." He stood. "Absolutely." Before we said goodbye, he gave me the number for his new cell phone. "This is awesome," I said, as I entered him in as a contact. Then, only half joking, I added, "Now I can text you when the FBI arrests me." He put his hands on my shoulders. "That's not going to happen." I hoped he was right. On the ride home, I contemplated telling my parents about the FBI. Would they be angry with me if they found out I'd known about the hack but hadn't told anyone? Or would they be on my side and tell me what I should do? The more I thought about it, the more obvious the answer became. Of course I should tell them. Once I made my decision, I was eager to get home and see what advice Mom would have for me. But as I walked from the bus stop to my house, I had the distinct feeling that someone was watching me. Trying to be discreet, I glanced around without moving my head. When I didn't see anyone, I took a more broad look and that's when I saw two men in suits getting out of a car parked across the street. I knew those men. They were the FBI agents who had been in Hansen's office. Fighting the urge to run, I stared at them to let them know I saw them and tried to control my breathing, which was now coming in short gasps. "Morgan," Agent Murray, the one who had played the bad cop, called to me. "Stop." Like that was going to happen. Instead, I gave in to the powerful instinct to flee. I slid my backpack off of my shoulders and heard it hit the ground with a thump. Then I ran toward my neighborhood, my legs pumping and adrenaline coursing through my veins. As I ran, I wondered why this was happening to me again. I'd run from Hansen and Dimples when they'd first brought me to Camp Willamos. I'd run with Billy from a myriad of enforcers after we'd escaped, and then I'd run from Mills after escaping Holly. 2 out of 3 times I'd been caught, and both of those times had been terrifying. Now, as I approached the grassy front yard of one of my neighbors, I wondered what would happen this time. Glancing over my shoulder, I saw Murray right behind me and I braced for impact. A moment later, he slammed into me from the side and I skidded across the neighbor's lawn, my breath stolen from me as my body hit the ground. At least I didn't split my lip like I had when Dimples had tackled me outside of Camp Willamos. "Why are you running, Morgan?" Murray asked, out of breath as he rolled me onto my stomach and handcuffed my hands behind my back, then yanked me to my feet and began walking me back to the car. I won't be able to call Billy after all, I thought. I dragged in a breath as Atkinson joined his partner in marching me toward their car. At least they hadn't tasered me. I was put in the back seat where Murray leaned in to place the seatbelt across me. "Safety first," he said with a grin, and I wanted to spit on him for nearly crushing me on the grass, but fear made my mouth too dry to do the job. We drove in silence, and I wondered where they were taking me. When we pulled up to the Fox Run Police Department, I was kind of relieved. I wasn't sure if I'd been expecting to be taken to some secret government facility, but seeing my local police department gave me a feeling of comfort. That feeling was short-lived, however, because as soon as we arrived, Murray and Atkinson led me into an interrogation room, removed my handcuffs, then left. I half expected Holly to come through the door bearing drug-laced power bars, but no one came, and after a while I began to worry. Mom would expect me home by now. Would she think I was just being defiant and taking my time? Or would she think something had happened to me? Would she call Billy and ask him when I left his house? Or would she just wait for me to finally get home? My cell phone had been in my backpack, and of course the FBI agents hadn't given it back to me, so I had no way to call Mom. Chapter 80. Morgan. At the sound of the door opening, I jerked my head up and met the eyes of Agents Murray and Atkinson. I wondered if Murray would still play bad cop to Atkinson's good cop. Regardless, seeing them looking so official while I sat in a police interrogation room with who knows who on the other side of the mirrored window, I felt helpless and scared. What had Hannah told them? Should I tell them what I knew, or should I stay quiet? I could insist on having a lawyer present, but would that make me look guilty? It seemed like a lose-lose situation, and I didn't know what to do. "I want to call my parents," I said, as the agent sat across the table from me. "I'm sure you do," Murray said. "We've been trying to get a hold of them," Atkinson said. That was something at least, assuming it was true. "In the meantime," Atkinson said, "we have a few questions we'd like you to answer." My silence ploy had worked okay in Hansen's office, so I stared at him but didn't respond, not even a nod. "You should know," Murray began, "that you've been implicated in the database break-in at the Healthy Lifestyles Organization's website." What did that mean, implicated? What had Hannah told them? I knew she was the one behind the information they supposedly had about me. "In fact," Murray said, "we have proof that you organized the entire operation." "That's not true," I blurted. Murray smiled, and I clamped my mouth shut. "What is true, Morgan?" Atkinson said. "We want to help you work this out. You're young. You have your whole life in front of you. We don't want to see you in prison any more than you do." He leaned forward slightly and smiled. "Help us to help you." Prison? The thought terrified me. Did Hannah tell them something that made me look guilty? I reviewed what I knew. Even though I'd agreed to be the spokesperson early on, I hadn't actually done the video until Hannah had told me the hacker wasn't going to break into the HLO's database. It was only after we'd released the video that I'd found out that she'd lied to me and that the hack would be happening. Hansen had called me into his office and given me the chance to fess up, but I'd said I didn't know anything. I'd quit as spokesperson and told Hansen I was no longer tied to We Can Choose. Then the hacker had done his thing. Yes, I'd known the hack was going to take place and I hadn't told anyone, but was that a crime? I hadn't even known, and still didn't know, who the hacker was. "Come on, Morgan," Atkinson said. "Tell us who did it." "I don't know." The words slipped through my lips before I could stop them. "So you know about the hack," Murray said. It wasn't a question. Crap, I thought. My mouth had gone dry. "I want some water." "Sure," Atkinson said. "We'll get you some in a minute. But first, answer our question. What do you know about the data breach?" Data breach? That sounded so serious. My heart thumped dully in my chest as I met the gaze of the two men. "I want my parents." Murray chuckled. "I'm sure you do, but they're not here and they're not going to be able to help you." I knew it. They weren't trying to get a hold of my parents. I was completely on my own. Even so, I knew I shouldn't say anything, not without my parents or a lawyer or someone on my side. "I'm not going to say anything else without a lawyer." "Why do you need a lawyer?" Atkinson said, a look of concern on his face. "Only somebody with something to hide would need a lawyer. Are you trying to hide something, Morgan?" Yes, I thought. No, of course not. My voice was steady, which surprised me. But I want a lawyer to help me understand my rights. Murray stood and paced the room a couple of times, then sat on the edge of the table beside me. "You don't seem to understand that what happened is very serious." "Murray," Atkinson said, a warning tone in his voice, "we discussed this. If she tells us what she knows, we'll be done with her." Was that true, or were they playing with me? My instincts told me not to fall for it, although I was sorely tempted to spill my guts and be done with this. They must have noticed my hesitancy. "That's a one-time offer, Morgan," Murray said. "Tell us now or the offer goes away." He smiled. "No parents, no lawyers, just you and us." He motioned between himself and Atkinson. "Don't forget the people listening behind the mirrored window," I thought. "No," I said. "I won't say anything without a lawyer." Murray stared at me, then he sighed and moved to the seat on the other side of the table. "Why are you lying about visiting some other world?" The swift change in topic totally threw me. "What?" "I saw you telling your story." He did air quotes, then he laughed. "What a load of crap!" His face became serious. "Is that why you orchestrated the data breach? Because of your delusional belief that you visited some other world where it's illegal to be overweight?" "I'm not delusional," I said with intensity. "I was there. I was tasered by men just like you and dragged out of my home. They put me into a federally assisted thinning center." My eyes narrowed. "Did you catch that? Federally assisted. That's the government trying to," I did air quotes, "help people lose weight." Both men were quiet as I spoke, and I wondered if they were moved at all by my story. "Did you listen to the whole thing?" I asked. "Did you hear me describe the Saturday challenge? Did you listen to the reason I was put there in the first place? For sharing homemade cookies with my friends at school." I shook my head. "How can that be a crime?" I turned away from the agents sitting across from me and stared at the mirrored wall. "I don't know who's back there listening, but I hope that you can see the dangers in letting the government have so much control over what we eat and how much we weigh." I met the stares of Murray and Atkinson. "Now, unless you're going to arrest me, I'm leaving." My heart was pounding so hard that I thought it might burst, and I half expected them to throw me into a jail cell, but to my delight, Murray smiled. "You can leave, but don't think we're done with you." With shaky legs, I stood. I'll drive you home, Atkinson offered, still playing the good cop. Exhaustion washed over me, and I wanted nothing more than to get home. Okay. On the drive to my house, he didn't badger me or even talk to me as I stared out the passenger side window. When we reached my house, he opened my door, then handed me my backpack. I began walking away, but when he called my name, I stopped and turned. If that story you told is true, he said, then he frowned. Well, I think you should keep trying to convince people to change the way things are going. He smiled. Just don't break any laws doing it. I didn't, I said, and I won't. That's not the way I do things. He nodded. Okay. I walked toward my house, wondering how I was going to explain all of this to my parents. Chapter 81. Morgan. Why do you have to keep stirring things up? Dad asked, his nostrils flaring, which I knew meant he was particularly angry. We were in my parents' bedroom, where I told them about the data hack and being questioned by the FBI. He shook his head as he glanced at Mom, then he looked back at me. I can't believe you're under suspicion by the FBI. He glared at me. The FBI, Morgan. His voice rose in volume and intensity. What were you thinking? He clenched his jaw. You weren't, were you? That's the problem. You act without thinking, time after time after time. I had nothing to do with the hack, okay? I didn't want it to happen. I told Hannah to tell the hacker not to do it. But you got involved with this group anyway. You didn't think it through. I only did the video after Hannah said the hack wouldn't happen, but she lied to me to get me to do it. Did you tell this to the FBI? No. Like I told you, I told them I wouldn't tell them anything without a lawyer. Oh, he said, not mollified in the least. So now I have to hire a lawyer? That's just perfect, because I have stacks of cash lying around just waiting to be used to defend your stupidity. Steve, Mom said. He stared at her until she pressed her lips into a straight line. Then he looked back at me. What are you going to do now? I don't know. Maybe they'll figure out who the hacker is and then they'll leave me alone. They think you orchestrated it, Dad pointed out. That makes you culpable. His eyes widened. You could go to prison, Morgan. Don't you get it? Yes, I said, my voice rising. I get it, okay? I get that I could go to prison for something I didn't do. Tears filled my eyes, and my voice began to shake. I've been in a place just like prison. It sucked, okay? It sucked big time. I got my emotions under control, and my voice went soft and steady. I'm not going to go to prison. I'll make sure of it. How? Dad said. How can you possibly make sure that doesn't happen? I don't know yet, but I'll think of something. Dad's eyes went skyward before coming back to me. Then he shook his head. Don't get yourself into deeper trouble. In fact, I think you should pass any of your genius plans by me before you carry them out. Can you do that at least? That was fair. Rude, but fair. Okay. Good. He turned away like our discussion was over, but then he faced me again. By the way, you're grounded until further notice. Of course I was. Fine. And give me your cell phone. I pulled it out of my pocket and handed it to him. Thank you. Now go do your homework. I walked out of their bedroom and into mine, where I shut the door, then sank onto my bed. My thoughts whirled through my brain. I had so much to think about. How to prove I wasn't involved with a hack without implicating myself. How to stay true to the cause like Agent Atkinson had said. How to regain Dad's trust. How to keep the world from collapsing around me. I flung myself backward, then stared at the ceiling. First things first, I murmured. Then I thought about how I could prove that Hannah was the one behind the planning of the hack, and that I had believed it wasn't going to happen when I made the video, and then that I had tried to stop it. If the FBI could somehow hear her admit it, I thought. I sat up, knowing exactly how I could make that happen. I hurried back to Mom and Dad's room, where they were still talking, probably about how to afford an attorney for me, which made me feel terribly guilty. What do you want? Dad asked. You're supposed to be doing your homework. I know what I need to do, I said with a grin. He cocked his head like he was gearing up to hear my latest harebrained scheme. If I can just get Hannah to tell the FBI that I had nothing to do with the hack, they would probably let me off the hook." "How do you propose to make that happen?" Dad asked, clearly skeptical. "I can record Hannah admitting it, of course." My smile grew. "Tell me more." Now he seemed interested. "There must be an app that will let me make recordings. I'll have it turned on while I talk to her about the hack. Every time I've talked to her about it, she's been open, so I just need to record her telling the truth." The tension in Dad's face seemed to ease. "That could actually work." "I don't think recordings like that are admissible in court," Mom pointed out. "I'm not sure that matters," Dad said. "Our goal is to remove Morgan from the FBI's list of suspects. This could do that." "So you think it's a good idea?" I asked. "It's certainly worth a try." Beyond relieved that Dad liked my idea, I felt a weight lifted from my shoulders. "If you give me my phone back, I'll see if I can find an app that will work. Then I'll talk to Hannah at school tomorrow." Dad gave me my phone. "I really hope this works, Morgan." Then he appraised me. "You're my daughter, and I love you. You know I only want what's best for you, right?" Warmth spread through my chest. "Of course, and I'm really sorry for causing you and Mom so much trouble. I'll get a job so that I can pay you back for whatever a lawyer costs, if we have to get one." "We'll work it out," Dad said. Then he pulled me into a hug. I felt safe in his embrace, and I knew that even though he had been angry with me, he wouldn't leave me on my own. Back in my room, it didn't take long to find an app that would do the job. The recording would only start when there was sound, so I would activate the app before I began talking to Hannah. I practiced using it and remembered the special glasses Jack had given me to wear in Camp Willowmoss when I'd gone there as Hannah Jacobs. Those would sure come in handy now. The irony that I would be secretly recording the girl I'd been impersonating crashed over me, and I shook my head. My life had gone from crazy to surreal, but that didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was proving the truth. Then and only then could I focus back on what was truly important, telling the world that they needed to preserve their right to choose for themselves what and how much to eat. Chapter 82. Morgan. Now that I had my phone back, and now that I'd installed the app, I decided to call Billy and tell him everything that had happened since I left his house. He answered his cell phone right away. "Oh wow, Morgan," he said after I caught him up. "I wish I could be there with you right now." "Me too." I frowned. "Now that I'm grounded, though, I'm not sure when I'll be able to see you next." "Will you be able to talk on the phone when you want to, at least?" "I don't know. Maybe if things go well tomorrow, my parents will reconsider grounding me." He laughed. "Maybe." Yeah, I thought. I wouldn't hold my breath. "Anyway, Billy, I wanted to tell you about all the insane stuff that happened this afternoon." "I'm glad you stood up to those FBI guys." I wasn't sure where my courage had come from, but I was glad it had kicked in at the right moment. "Me too." When I got to school the next day, I activated the recording app, then began searching for Hannah. I found her a few minutes later near her locker, but when she saw me coming, she began walking in the other direction. If that doesn't show guilt, I thought, I don't know what does. I hurried after her. "Hannah, wait! I need to talk to you." She glanced over her shoulder. "I can't right now." Then she rushed onward. Sighing, I turned off the app. At least we had second period together, so she couldn't hide from me for long. Apparently she had something else in mind, because when I got to second period right before it started, she wasn't there. I took my seat, hoping she would sit nearby, but when she got to class, she sat on the other side of the room, and then she left the moment class finished. I would have to track her down at lunch. At the beginning of the lunch break, I went directly to the cafeteria where I saw Sarah, Olivia, and Katie, but no Hannah. I looked around the cafeteria but didn't see her. Determined to track her down, I turned on the app and walked up and down the halls, knowing she had to be around somewhere. As I rounded the last corner, I spotted her halfway down the hall, talking on her cell phone. Her back was to me, so I tiptoed up behind her. My only purpose in being stealthy was to catch up to her before she could avoid me, but as it turned out, I overheard what sounded like an important conversation. I promise I didn't tell them anything about you, she was saying into the phone pressed against her ear. I pulled out my cell phone and held it by my side, casually enough so it wouldn't be obvious I was recording, but close enough so that it would pick up her side of the conversation. No, she continued. I convinced them that it was Morgan's op, and she doesn't know who you are, so don't worry. She paused as she listened. That won't happen. You're too clever. A pause. Okay, I'll talk to you later. Bye. I silently moved back to the corner of the hallway, then waited a beat before calling to her. There you are, Hannah. She spun around, guilt written all over her face. Morgan. I smiled like I hadn't just heard her admit that she'd set me up, and walked toward her. I've been trying to find you, Hannah. Her features smoothed out. Well, you found me. She took a step in my direction. What's up? I stopped beside her. Why didn't you sit by me in class? Oh, I was almost late, and I didn't want to walk to the back of the room. Okay. I'm hungry. She tucked her phone in her back pocket. I'm going to the cafeteria. When she made a move to walk past me, I reached out and touched her arm. Hang on. There's not much time to eat, she said. Annoyance clouded her eyes. What do you want? My cell phone was still in my hand, a good place to clearly record our conversation. Billy has a few questions he wants answered before he'll work with We Can Choose. Her brow furrowed. I thought he'd already agreed to work with us. It was a conditional agreement, I said. Then I smiled, like we were all in this together. Billy knows that you and your hacker friend erased the HLO's data, and, well, he's a little concerned. I mean, neither Billy nor I want to do anything illegal, so he's worried about what you guys might do in the future. I frowned. You realize that I only agreed to do the video when I thought the hack wouldn't happen. I laughed, like I'd forgiven her indiscretion, but then you had your hacker friend do it anyway. I paused. If Billy and I are going to work with We Can Choose, we need to know what else you have planned. Hannah stared at me like she was trying to figure out my game. Finally she said, Look, Morgan, I don't think you're the right person to be our spokesperson after all. Her mouth puckered. I'm the one in charge, and I'll decide what's right for our group. Whether that means hacking into some organization's database and erasing their data or making propaganda videos, I'll do what I want. I needed her to be more specific in taking responsibility for the data breach, so I said, I heard the FBI is looking into that hack. Aren't you worried they'll find out that you planned it? She laughed. No, I think they have another suspect in mind. Fury boiled in my stomach, and as much as I wanted to wrap my fingers around her neck and squeeze, I forced myself to smile pleasantly. Really? So you don't think they'll find out it's you? I'm sure they won't, she said. There's nothing tying me to it. She laughed. I'm hardly even tied to We Can Choose. You're more tied to it than I am. I forced myself to remain calm. Who does the FBI think did it, Hannah? Who's the other suspect they have in mind? I gave her my most innocent expression, although I knew good and well that it was me she'd implicated as a suspect. She smirked. I don't know. They just told me they had a suspect. When did you talk to them? Yesterday, she said. I guess they were talking to some of your friends since you've been so vocal about your opposition to the HLO. Opposition that you share, I said. She laughed. Well, yeah, but you're the public face of that opposition. Not anymore, I said. She shrugged. Well, I said, I hope the FBI doesn't figure out that you're the one behind the hack. I almost choked on the words. They won't. I'm much too clever for them. Giddy that she'd admitted so much, I just nodded. I'm starving, she said. I'm going to have lunch. I have to go to the library and do some homework, I said. See ya, she said. Once she was out of sight, I counted to 60, then I played back our recording, pressing my phone to my ear to listen. Our voices were crystal clear, even the conversation I'd overheard earlier. Yes, I whispered, thrilled that I'd gotten what I needed. Chapter 83. Morgan. That's unbelievable, Dad said, after he'd listened to the recording I'd made. Mom just shook her head. What should we do now? I asked, glad I wasn't on my own. Dad looked at Mom. What do you think? Should I call that attorney we talked about?
Probably, she said. He ought to be able to get Morgan immunity if she hands over this information. That's how I ended up sitting across the table from Agents Murray and Atkinson with an attorney by my side. The FBI had agreed not to press any charges against me for failing to report the impending hack if I gave them the information they needed to know who was responsible for it. I'd made it clear that I didn't know who the hacker was, but that I knew the person who did know. Evidently, that was enough for them, and now we sat together as I played the recording of Hannah confessing her part. When it was done, both agents smiled.
"Looks like you're in the clear, Morgan," Atkinson said.
Overwhelming relief flowed over me, and tears pushed into my eyes. I kept them at bay, but I couldn't keep a wide smile from blossoming on my mouth.
"Do you need anything else from my client?" my attorney asked. "No, she's free to go."
I nearly leapt from my chair before rushing out into the waiting area to let Mom and Dad know how it had gone. "I'm glad that's done," I said as I hugged them both.
"What have you learned?" Dad asked.
"Let's see," I said with a smile as I held up my hand and began counting off on my fingers. 1. Don't be involved with a group that might do shady things. 2. If I know something illegal is going to happen, don't keep it to myself. 3. Talk to you guys sooner. And 4. If I want to promote my point of view, don't let other people dictate the rules. Raising my eyebrows, I looked at Dad.
"Yeah," he said. "I think that about covers it."
Mom drew me into another hug while Dad talked to our attorney, then the three of us drove home. "Am I still grounded?" I asked from the back seat.
"For now, yes," Dad said.
I hoped they would change their minds soon, but in the meantime I would accept my punishment. When we got home, I called Billy to tell him the latest.
"So the FBI is done with you?"
"Yes, thank goodness."
"I hope Hannah knows I'm not going to have anything to do with her group now."
I laughed. "Yeah, I think she'll figure that out pretty soon. Of course, I don't know if she'll have a group after the FBI talks to her." I paused. "I kind of feel sorry for her. I mean, she's going to be in big trouble."
"Yeah, but it's her own fault. You warned her how many times?"
As true as that was, I still felt sorry for her.
"My parents are having a barbecue on Saturday. They wanted me to invite you and your family."
"I'll tell them. Then even if I'm grounded, I'll be able to see you."
"Exactly."
At dinner that night, I told Mom and Dad about the invitation, and they agreed that it would be nice to get to know Billy's new family. "We have to go," Zach said, his face serious. "I have some new card tricks I need to show Billy."
"Well, that settles it," Dad said. "We're going."
We all laughed, and I looked at the faces of my family and felt a new appreciation for them. Through all of my mistakes, and I was sure I would make more of them, my family had stood by me. Even Billy had never wavered in his support of me, even when I didn't listen to his advice. I knew I was a very lucky girl to have such good people in my life, and now, as I listened to the conversation at the table, I smiled, at peace with myself and with my life. Epilogue. Morgan. After intense pressure from the FBI, Hannah gave up the name of the hacker, and he was sentenced to several years in prison. Hannah, however, was able to get off with a hefty fine and a whole lot of hours of community service. She was also forced to give up We Can Choose. For the next 2 rounds of weigh-ins, so many kids refused to participate that Holly's HLO announced that they were stopping the pilot program. Even though she claimed it was due to lack of funding, I believed it was due to lack of cooperation by the very people whose data she needed to gather. I finished out the school year at Brightwood High School without any more run-ins with Hanson, then I was able to return to Fox Run the next school year. Billy and I did several more YouTube videos, not associated with any group, where we gave more details about his world and talked about our concerns regarding where our world seemed to be headed. The videos became quite popular, and we were invited to be interviewed by several talk shows. After a lot of thought, we agreed to do a few of them, and slowly it seemed that the public was starting to come around to our point of view. With all of the publicity, Billy and I became minor celebrities, which neither one of us liked. The government also took notice of our story, and after asking us to show them the location of the hut, they tore it down and filled in the tunnel. I guess they didn't want to take a chance that anyone else would try to cross from one universe to another. Days after they finished their demolition, Billy and I hiked to the hut's location and saw that all traces of the tunnel were gone. I was glad, but I could see that Billy's feelings were mixed. He later told me that he mostly felt relieved to know that he was in my world to stay. The new food regulations started at our school and across the country, and even though many people were unhappy with the new rules, it didn't seem likely that they would be changing anytime soon, not as long as the people in power wanted the government to have more control over our lives. Though it took Billy a little while to get used to having parents who were actually involved in his life, he was very happy with his family, and I was thrilled for him. Billy and I got together as often as we could, and we planned on going to college together once we graduated from high school. Billy never again regretted coming to my world, and even though I'd been through horrific things in his world, in the end, I was glad I'd had that experience. I knew if I had the opportunity to change things, I would make the same choices I'd made before. The things I'd learned were too valuable to give up, and I wouldn't want to lose all the priceless knowledge I'd gained. I'd discovered how important my family was to me, and how lucky I was to have the family I had. I'd also come to appreciate the power of being able to choose for myself, and I knew I would do all within my power to make sure I never lost that precious gift. My world, even with all its flaws, was the place I wanted to be. I would be forever grateful that I'd made it home, and that once I'd gotten there, perhaps I'd even made a difference. This has been Dare to Oppose Part 6, Parallel World, Book 4, written and narrated by Christine Kersey. Copyright 2014 by Christine Kersey. Thanks for listening.